So as wild animals, habitats, nature has faced growing challenges, there's been a movement for conservation, for humans to step in and take action to preserve species diversity, genetic diversity, and ecosystem diversity. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that. And I want to start by just talking about what are some of those challenges to conservation. And the number one challenge is human need. As human population growth has occurred, the demands on our environment have increased because humans need food, they need water, they need space. That puts human needs and uses in conflict with nature more and more in modern times than historically. Though, humans have a long history of uh, challenging the natural environment, and the first animals to be caused to go extinct goes back hundreds of years, thousands of years by humans. And so then if we're facing this tension between human needs and the needs of nature, we have to sort of make a case for why sometimes we prioritize nature over human needs and uses. And so there's some arguments that actually put humans in the center of that. So first of all, saying, well, nature actually does have economic benefits for humans. We extract a lot of uses from nature, like pharmaceuticals, for example. Nature has inherent other benefits that are maybe not economic, like they help stabilize the environment, they make better soil, they stabilize water and hold water for us. So there's some of those aspects to it. And then there's sort of a more ethical argument, which says that nature has inherent value to humans, that we have an ethical obligation to maintain the other living things. I like one way of putting it is that as far as we know it, these are our only living companions in the whole universe. And so we should preserve them because that's it, right? That's it. It also says that we have a fundamental relationship with nature, and that there's growing evidence that our mental health and our physical health is better when we're exposed to nature. And so those are all arguments for conservation. So we'll take a look at a couple of conservation strategies. And so this is a huge topic, so I'm kind of really bring it in tight. Some of the major focuses of conservation are on habitat conservation. And this is kind of a preventative, like let's try and prevent loss of this habitat. Species conservation, oftentimes focusing on just one single species, again, as maybe a prevention focus. And then there's the restoration aspect. So once something is harmed, what are we going to do? So restoration of a damaged habitat or restoration of a threatened or endangered species once it's on the brink of extinction. So we'll take a closer look at those. So habitat conservation is challenging because, again, as human populations grow, more and more land is necessary, or maybe not necessary, but wanted for human life. And so that creates a fundamental question of, if we have a limited amount of land that we can conserve, what land should we prioritize? So we know we need this much for humans, so what little bit are we going to save for animals, and why would we choose that area? And there's a couple of different philosophies as to what land should be prioritized for saving. One approach is to go for areas that have megadiversity. That means like greatest number of species. So we would tend to preserve megadiversity areas and areas with high species richness, so equatorial regions then. Other approaches say, okay, no, it's not about just how many species there are. Let's focus on areas that have unique species or endemic species. So there are some areas around the globe, and these are kind of more scattered, not just equatorial, where there's really unique species present there. And then a third approach is to say, well, let's be careful and make sure that we're actually saving representative habitats. So let's save a little bit of everything. We need some taiga, we need some tundra, we need some rainforest, we need some temperate forest. And so all of these approaches are valid. There's not necessarily one that's better than the other, but it is kind of one way to argue for preserving certain areas. So once a decision has been made about protecting space, the actual design of that space can also be challenging. So, for example, questions will come up about whether it's better to have one large area, like one huge preserve. So imagine a country like this. Do we want to have like a big reserve like this? Or would it be better to have a reserve where we have reserves here, 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 and here? This might be the same overall area, but it's broken up differently. This can be challenged by something called edge effects. So we've found that the edges of reserve areas, so like these areas here, tend to be different than the interior. Like it tends to have different organisms present in it. And so if you go with smaller areas, you're getting more edge effects. Sometimes, though also you can go with a circle versus a square. You get less edge effects with a circle. Okay, so you can help mitigate those edge effects by having them be a circle. The other question is, how far apart should preserves be? So here I've spaced them somewhat evenly. Another question might be, would it be better to have them clustered more like this? And so why would that maybe be better? Because organisms could maybe move more readily between them, right? Though we could also add movement corridors. So I might have connections between my reserve areas, little narrow pathways that animals can travel through. This can be really important for organisms that migrate, so migrating animals, or animals that have large territories, or travel to find mates. So those are all reasons why wildlife corridors might be really important. The Denver metro area is a really interesting example of wildlife corridors. And this wasn't necessarily intentional in many cases, but what you see is a lot of preserved land along waterways. So in many cases, this may have historically been because this land wasn't useful for a lot of other purposes, but you see that many of the creeks in Aurora, for example, have a trail along them and a tiny band of public land. And so this has prevented it from being developed, and it allows animals to move along the creek bed. If you track, for example, say Sand Creek, the Sand Creek Greenway connects to the Platte River Trail. The Platte River Trail connects all the way up into like Chatfield Reservoir and then all the way up into the mountains. If you look at another example, the Highline Canal is a strip of water and land that goes all the way back into the mountains as well. And so you see animals able to migrate all the way from Aurora into the mountains along these wildlife corridors. And I like to point this out because it is something really nice and special about Denver Metro. In other areas, like in Southern California, a lot of the waterways were cemented over. And so if you look, for example, at the LA River, the LA River is basically a giant concrete ditch. That is not a wildlife corridor. And so you see that wildlife has not been able to live in human spaces survive in human spaces quite as well in areas where that's happened. This is a picture of European farmland. And so European farmland is really interesting, again, for historical reasons. They typically have what are called hedgerows in between different farm fields. So people didn't have the money for fences to separate their land, and so they would plant them with shrubs to separate their land. So this might be one person's field, this might have been another person's field, again, historically. And then there are sections of forest that were also preserved, again, for historical reasons. And so what you ended up with is what became wildlife corridors and preserved areas. And this has helped some wildlife, not all, but some wildlife survive in this farmland. The U.S. has faced a challenge in that, again, for historical reasons, we did not develop our farmland this way. And so you can actually have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of miles of uninterrupted farm fields that have no space for wildlife. And that's how it really becomes a wildlife desert, is there's all of the ground has been plowed under. None of it has been left in shrubs that could be wildlife habitat. So we were focusing just now on habitat conservation. We'll take a look at single species conservation now. Sort of like with habitat conservation, we run into the problem of which species to focus on, right? If we only have so much money, so much time and energy, which species should we focus on saving? And so there's a couple of different cases or arguments for certain species. So for example, sometimes we focus on indicator species. These are species that sort of confirm the overall health of an ecosystem. So polar bears, for example, are an indicator for global climate change. The worse the polar bears do, the worse we'll know that climate change is having an impact, right? And if the polar bears are doing okay, then that can be an indicator for overall health of that ecosystem, of the polar ecosystem in the face of climate change. Umbrella species are species that have really large habitat requirements. And so if you focus on protecting that umbrella species, it can have the side consequence or side effect of saving a whole swath of habitat. So the northern spotted owl needs a very large area of old growth forest for survival and reproduction. So efforts to protect the northern spotted owl have had the side benefit of protecting large swaths of old growth forest. So like if their nest is protected, you're protecting a huge amount of forest. Flagship species is a species that's just really appealing to the public. So this is more of a human focus. They're generally really recognizable, cute and cuddly a lot of times as well, or just sort of iconic. And so you see like the American bison, the giant panda, the Florida panther. These are examples of flagship species. The wolf is another one I could mention for many people as a flagship species. They just become really symbolic to people and can garner a lot of fundraising and attention. And the fourth one here is a keystone species. These are species within a community that have a large influence on that community, more than you would predict based on how many there are. So a lot of times they're either a key food source for many organisms, or they actually alter the environment in some way. So plants that are eaten by a lot of organisms or are particularly important at certain times of year, or ecosystem engineers like beavers. Beavers actually create habitat for other organisms because they stop the flow of water and create a pond habitat. So that would be one argument for protecting beavers. So if an area has already been severely damaged, then we would shift our conservation focus to restoration. So restoration ecology is the repair or replacement of a damaged habitat. So for example, in a place where there was a landfill or an old mine, there might be attempts at habitat restoration. So a landfill will oftentimes, there'll be efforts to replant in that area. And you can see this like in Denver Metro, like the old Lowry landfill, which is out by Quincy and on Gun Club Road, basically just mostly looks like prairie. This is behind the Dad's landfill. So you still have the modern day Dad's landfill, but behind that is the Lowry landfill. And it essentially looks like a grassland ecosystem. It's still a super fun site because there was a lot of toxic waste dumped there. But from the outside, it looks like a rehabilitated area. Rocky Mountain Arsenal is another area that has been rehabilitated, kind of because nobody could build on it, to be honest. So the human activities that happened there left it so unsafe that it can never be built on for human purposes. And so it's been essentially turned into a wildlife preserve in the middle of Denver, Commerce City area. In some cases, a habitat might be so damaged that replacement is an option. And so this is deep mine pits in England. And the pits were so big, there was no way there could be establishment or rehabilitation of the existing environment, but they filled with water and became basically ponds and became an aquatic ecosystem. And Then species restoration focuses on trying to help a species that was so endangered or threatened that something had to happen or they would become extinct. So one of the big approaches here is captive breeding. And so this happens in some cases when a species is basically extinct in the wild. So sometimes they actually have to take the last of the species into protection and then breed them. That happened with the California condors. There was only 22 California condors left when captive breeding was initiated. So a massive captive breeding program started, and then they started to re-release captive reared birds to the wild. And so that was a huge deal in 2002 when the first pair of captive bred birds was released, and then they actually bred in the wild. So they were able to have babies on their own in the wild. And that's the goal. You don't want to keep having to breed the animals in a facility. You want them to be able to start surviving on their own. Pandas are undergoing a captive breeding program in China right now in order to re-release them into the wild. So this is a really last resort effort, to be honest. It's very expensive. It's difficult to do. So especially if you want to re-release them into the wild, you have to make sure they don't become acclimated to humans. And so this picture here is a baby condor, and this is a condor puppet. So underneath this is the hand of a human, and this condor puppet has been made with a dead condor in order to try and make sure this baby condor doesn't become acclimated to humans. You'll see with panda captive breeding, they wear panda suits to try and make sure the pandas don't get used to the sight of humans. In a lot of cases, sometimes species restoration will just be initiated by habitat conservation. So for some species, if you can protect their habitat and give them just a little bit of protection and from human interference, they can recover on their own without captive breeding. And so again, the American bald eagle I've mentioned before, some steps were made to protect their habitat and to prevent human interference with their nests, and the banning of DDT. And so they were able to recover without ever having to have an expensive captive breeding program.